How are you doing, dear students? I hope that you are doing well, inshallah. This is your professor, Assistant Professor Ibrahim al-Bayati. I'll be giving you a lecture concerning consecutive interpreting, and our today's topic will be about how to take notes. As you know, in fact, most of you face difficulty in taking notes within the process of listening in consecutive interpreting class. Therefore, I decided to give you this virtual lecture, and this will be uploaded on my YouTube channel for the sake of getting benefit from this opportunity. First of all, we have talked about the introduction of consecutive interpreting. Consecutive interpreting is defined as one of the most important types of oral translation. It's concerned with the process of receiving the info from the source language speaker. Within the process of listening, the interpreter takes notes for the most important remarks said by the speaker. Then he is going to produce another version of the message in the target language. That's consecutive interpreting, and that's the definition of consecutive interpreting. We have talked about the fact that why should consecutive interpreters take notes? Why should I take notes as a consecutive interpreter? What's the role of consecutive interpreting taking notes process in this important regard? As we know that consecutive interpreting is different from simultaneous interpreting. Consecutive interpreting is based on listening, taking notes, and then producing a message in the target language. So it's based on the memorization technique. In other words, the interpreter must enhance himself in memorization, must develop his mental repertoire for the sake of producing something well knitted in the target language. Therefore, he needs a paper and a pen to write down the most important notes. Unlike simultaneous interpreting, as the name suggests, it requires no memorization and it requires no notes at all because it's something simultaneous. It's done immediately. Due to the process of listening and waiting for the speaker to end up his, let's say, turn, the consecutive interpreter must take notes because he doesn't have, let's say, much time to remember the whole message that he presented in the source language. In other words, the speaker may speak for 1 minute, 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, 5 minutes maximum. Then the interpreter must produce a message in the target language. During the process of listening, that he has to write down notes because he doesn't have time and he doesn't have a good memory that can embrace all the words that he said during the 5 minutes of speech. It will be a long time and it will making pressure on the mental repertoire of the interpreter himself or herself. Therefore, we have to pay attention to this point. This is why consecutive interpreters are asked to take notes during the process of listening and interpreting for the speaker. This is a very important point that we have to bear in mind. Number two, which is important as well, there is another question raised. What are the elements that must be written during the process of listening or listening process? And this is another important point that we have to talk about today. Should we write down the whole message? Should consecutive interpreter students write down everything they hear about the speech? Should they take certain elements or should they take simple elements? To answer this question, we have to understand the nature of the message that the interpreter listens to. In other words, the interpreter is not allowed to take notes of every single word uttered by the speaker. Otherwise, it will be something shameful. I advise you all, dear students, dear consecutive interpreters who work as freelancers or even work for government institutions or even embassies or even tourism agencies or whatsoever institution. I advise you all not to write the whole message on the paper, because this is not going to be defined as consecutive interpreting. It's going to be defined as outside translation. And there is a unique difference between outside translation here and consecutive interpreting. Outside translation is about reading a text which is written and transferring it into an oral message. For example, if you go to a doctor and your father asks you kindly to read and translate the prescription of a doctor from English into Arabic, this is called outside translation, because you read something written and you produce a message in the oral version. That's outside, and this is different from consecutive interpreting. Therefore, the interpreter must know something, that you are not allowed to take every single word mentioned by the speaker in the original language into consideration once you produce a message in the target language. You have to bear this important point in mind. You have to take certain elements. So, what are these elements? And this is something important. The elements are as follows: proper nouns, names of cities, names of countries, rivers, okay, names of institutions, digits, numbers, financial issues, dates of birth. Okay, we also have statistics. We also have, let's say, bank accounts. We have average. We have rates of success. We have rising numbers on failure as well. All these things must be taken care of carefully. We must be very careful with numbers, especially when we talk about numbers of, let's say, financial issues. Because if you are going to make a mistake on the level of millions and billions, you can cause huge fiasco in the economic industry. You might cause real headache for certain companies, and you might get fired for causing this problem, and you might cause real problem for the agency that you work for as well. This is why I advise you, dear students, dear consecutive interpreters, wherever you are, to pay attention to this important fact. You must be very careful in dealing with numbers, and you must give extraordinary attention to every single digit you hear during the process of listening and taking notes. So you have to be very careful. I repeat myself. In addition to these elements, you must care about the numberings of events, and we have the, let's say, arrangements of things. For example, if the speech is about 4 important elements presented by the speaker, for example, an ambassador is speaking about something important with reference to environment. He speaks about climate change, then he moves to the impact of greenhouse emissions, and then he talked about, let's say, tobacco industry, and at the end of the day, he spoke about friendly environment products. In such a way, you are not allowed to take these important notes haphazardly. In other words, you must take these notes in accordance with what? In accordance with the arrangements of these products, these important statements mentioned by the original speaker, for the sake of making everything clear for the target language viewers or even listeners who listen to you. In other words, I'm not allowed to highlight the notes of the last point raised by the speaker at the beginning of the speech. It will cause some sort of confusion for the target language viewers. You have to take these notes in accordance with the arrangements of the speech made by the original speaker. If he speaks about climate change, these notes in the first part of the notes should be about climate change, and then you move to friendly environment. For example, cars. Before that, you have to deal with greenhouse emissions and etc. in accordance with the arrangements made by the original speaker. There must be some sort of, let's say, concordance in this regard. We have talked about something super important as well concerning the tools that the consecutive interpreters can count on during the process of interpreting. What are the tools? The first important tool that he must make use of is abbreviation, especially when he interprets from, let's say, Arabic into English. Arabic language is not that language that cares about abbreviation. This is not the case with English. English is abbreviation language oriented, while Arabic is not abbreviation language oriented. For example, when the speaker speaks about تنظيم داعش الإرهابي, for example, he can make use of ISIS, ISIS, or IS only. Instead of saying تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية داعش الإرهابي, it's a very long message. And you can transfer it into English successfully, but you need time. And you don't have time, by the way, because time is money in consecutive interpreting. Therefore, it's advised to make use of abbreviations because this is already known for the target language viewers and listeners, the ones who receive your message in the target language. You can say IS did so and so, or ISIS, whatever option you may find appropriate. We come to the point of, let's say, nouns. رئيس الوزراء العراقي. Instead of saying Iraqi Prime Minister, Iraqi PM, PM, which is the abbreviation of what? Prime Minister. So this is another tool, another way of describing events. We talk about, let's say, countries' names like United المملكة المتحدة. And instead of saying المملكة المتحدة, United Kingdom in English, you can make use of UK. UK is another, let's say, abbreviation to describe, let's say, a very big nation in the world, especially in the European continent. We have مجلس الأمن الدولي. مجلس الأمن الدولي, you can describe it in 4 letters only, UNSC, which means United Nations Security Council. We talk about, let's say, المفوضية العليا المستقلة للانتخابات في العراق. Look at this prolonged statement. You can abbreviate it in the following: IHEC. IHEC is defined as a good message, which means what? Independent High Electoral Commission. I think this is very clear for you now. This is the first tool of taking notes in consecutive interpreting. We have another tool called necessary omission. Necessary omission means what? It means that when there are more than one single adjective describing the person in question, you can remove 2 or 3 adjectives and you can keep one, because this is going to be enough for the receivers of the message in the target language. How can we model this for you? It's a piece of cake for sure. دولة رئيس الوزراء السيد مصطفى الكاظمي. دولة رئيس الوزراء, you can say His Excellency Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi. Or you can summarize the whole message, Iraqi PM al-Kadhimi, because Iraqi PM, which means Iraqi Prime Minister, PM means the first tool that we made use of in taking notes process and consecutive interpreting, and al-Kadhimi is the last name of Iraqi Prime Minister's name. So Iraqi PM al-Kadhimi, enough for describing the Arabic message, دولة رئيس الوزراء السيد مصطفى الكاظمي, and this is gonna be super important for you in the process of taking notes. You have to bear all these points in mind, dear students. And now we talk to the point of compression. Compression, for example, when we mention one word repeatedly in Arabic, as we know that Arabic language likes redundancy. Redundancy is defined as one of the figurative tools employed in Arabic. But this is not the case in English, because English language is not figurative, is not, let's say, redundant oriented. For example, 20 سنة من النجاح, 20 سنة من الانتصارات, 20 سنة من let's say التفوق, 20 years of success and victories. That's enough because you've mentioned the word 20 at the beginning, so you don't have to mention it every time. Every time. This is going to be compressing the whole message, and this is going to be in favor of what? This is going to be in favor of the mentality of the consecutive interpreter. And instead of saying الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية, you can be satisfied with Iran only. Iran, IRAN, is enough for you to compress it in this way. And now we talk about the most important element, which is called the integration of consecutive interpreters' mental maps with the note-taking process. And this is a very important point that we have to bear in mind. What does this mean? Some students fail in, let's say, keeping pace with the listening, and they're gonna focus on writing only, and this is a big failure. This is a big failure in consecutive interpreting. What does this mean? This means that the students of consecutive interpreting subject must focus on the listening process and note-taking process at the same time. There must be a happy marriage between these two processes. There must be some sort of balance between these processes. This is why consecutive interpreters must be good listeners. They have to have good listening, and they have to have good command on their listening skills, and they have to have good command on their writing skills at the same time. How is that? For example, when I listen to the speaker's message in the Arabic language, I have to be careful in listening, keep listening to the speech and writing down the most important elements that I told you at the beginning of this lecture. And then once the speaker stops speaking, I have to link the dots. That's my job. That's my way of dealing and handling the problems. I have to link the dots between what I have written with what I have listened to, because I don't write down every single word I hear. I write down the most important elements where I can link them with the things I have heard in advance. For example, when you write down, for example, ISIS, PM, UK, you have to link the dots. ISIS, which means الدولة الداعشية أو تنظيم داعش الإرهابي. PM, Prime Minister. UK means United Kingdom. And it's preferable to write down the notes in the target language. For example, when the speech is in Arabic, you must take the notes in English as long as you are assigned to interpret it into English, so as to facilitate the process of, let's say, interpreting it into English language successfully. Because if you are going to write down the notes in Arabic, this means you are going to carry out two types of translation at the same time. Outside translation for the Arabic word that you have written, because you are going to outside translate it from Arabic into English in your mind, and then you are going to produce a message which is called consecutive interpreting based on the notes that you've written in the note-taking process. This is the point. Instead of making pressure on your mentality, instead of weakening your memorization techniques, you can enrich your mentality with following certain rules, and these rules presented to you. The most important thing is to create a very successful integration between what has been heard and what has been written by you. This is a very important step. You have to keep listening without any sort of problem. The more you listen, the more you'll be able to write down successfully all the notes that you want. So what's the most important solution for the failures of some students in consecutive interpreting taking notes process? The most important solution is to keep writing notes. You must listen and you must keep taking notes for the sake of advancing your skills, and then you are going to be able to produce something highly appreciated by the audience. And we have to bear something in mind as well. We have to understand people's view, the intended viewers, let's say, mentality. We can't say something that, let's say, doesn't match the mentality of the viewer in question. So we have to care about the intended listeners and receivers of the message. We have to make use of words that suit their mentality. Otherwise, there will be some sort of gap, because you may mention something not understood by them, and then it will cause some sort of confusion. And this is not acceptable in consecutive interpreting. You can know all these things by reading and understanding the ones that they are listening to you in advance. For example, you can ask the agency that you work for, to whom I'm going to interpret. Are they academic figures? Are they children? Are they laymen? Are they, let's say, American Iraqis? So as to understand the way that you can address the message that you are going to produce in the target language. All these things will be taken care of during the process of taking notes. I repeat myself, taking notes is defined as the backbone of consecutive interpreting. If you have good skills with reference to taking notes, you will be good consecutive interpreter. And I advise you all to watch as many interviews, as many speeches of United Nations as possible in different languages, so as to get used to these important dialects and so as to be able to take notes. You may face difficulty at the beginning, but you can get great benefit at the end of the day. Once you are going to be assigned to interpret for someone important, and he's going to like your interpreting, and he's going to assign you once again. And this is going to be a very amazing thing, and you're going to be feeling something. You're going to be proud of yourself. Trust me, dear students, dear colleagues, dear freelance consecutive interpreters. At the end of this important presentation, I'd like to tell something important. In conclusion, consecutive interpreting is defined as something that you have to work on from day one. Even if you are translators, you are in translation department, and you haven't reached consecutive interpreting level, which is studied and presented in the third, let's say, grade, you have to carry on interpreting, and you have to be ready and study for this stage by watching TV shows, and by taking notes, and by recording your voice, so as to know how far you are capable of training yourself on these types of methods that you listen to, you watch, you get benefit from this lecture, and so on. This is my own piece of advice. Keep watching in TV shows, keep watching news bulletins for the sake of building yourself. And we have to remember something super important. Taking notes is defined as the backbone of consecutive interpreting. Therefore, you have to pay attention to it. At the end of this lecture, I'm very thankful to you, and thank you so much, and see you in next lectures, inshallah. Thank you again. Thank you again.